Thanks for listening to our daily Bible reading lesson. The lesson today is the beginning of wisdom. You know, my dad, just an old East Texas boy, had all sorts of little sayings that he came up with that kind of amazed me and my brother and sister. One of them was whenever he would talk about some of the engineers where he worked in building aircraft. And he'd say, they're smart as can be, but they couldn't pour water out of a boot with instructions on the heel. Well, what he meant was they didn't have common sense. They didn't have wisdom. In other words, they had the knowledge, but they didn't always know how to put it into action. Well, sometimes, whenever he's dealing with me, he'd say, "Son, you know better than that." In other words, I did something, and he was assured that I had the knowledge to make a better decision, but I didn't always do that. Well, biblically, I'm afraid there's a lot of us that sometimes get into that situation. Whenever we do that, we're talking about wisdom or the lack of it. Wisdom is the capacity or ability to make use of knowledge that we have. In our reading some time back, we saw in 1 Samuel 18:14 that David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. That tells us, of course, that wisdom is that which guides proper actions. It gains approval from God. Well, why did he do that? And why do sometimes people fail? Well, in our reading yesterday in Psalm 110 or 111 rather, we find where David speaks about that very thing. Notice what he says in describing God. He talks about praising God with his whole heart in the first verse, but then he says in verse 2, he says, "The works of the Lord are great." In verse 3, his work is honorable and glorious. His righteousness endureth forever. He has made his wonderful works to be remembered in verse 4. He's gracious and full of compassion. He's given meat unto them that fear him. He will ever be mindful of his covenant in verse 5. He showed his people the power of his works in verse 6. In verse 7, the works of his hands are verity and judgment. All his commandments are sure. In verse 8, they stand fast forever and are done in truth and uprightness. In verse 9, he sent redemption unto his people. I mean, you look at that and look at David's estimation of knowledge of God, who he was. And thus in verse 10, he says, "Now the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." Now that word fear there doesn't mean like trembling and horror, but what it's talking about is standing in awe, a reverential awe as we look at God, who he is, what he's done, what he will do. And you can't help but act wisely whenever you have that within your heart. He goes on and he says, "A good understanding have all they that do his commandments." In other words, we understand those things of God. And what an amazing life it brings forth. If I live the life that David does, or you can take, for example, Paul, the same attitude of knowing God. If I live that life, it's because of my godly fear, my awe of him. I look in 2 Timothy 1 and verse 12. Paul talked about how there was pressures upon him, and he said, "Nevertheless, I'm not ashamed, for I know whom I believed." David was saying the same thing. He walked in wisdom because he knew God. As you go through today, if you're like me, sometimes you'll find yourself looking and say, "Why did I do that? I knew better than that." Well, maybe what I need to do is sit down and study and get a little better remembrance of who God is, what he's done, what he's promised. What an amazing God he is. And if I do that, I can be like David and walk wisely, and God will be with me. Thank you for listening. You have a great day. Thank you again for joining us in this Bible study. We remind you, if you'd like to follow along in our daily Bible reading, the link below in the description of this video will give you the PDF so you can read right along with us. If you have any other questions or if you'd like information on a Bible study, contact us with the information provided on the screen before you.